2 hours ago, something happened inside the Canadian Parliament that no political strategist in Washington, Ottawa, or Brussels had modeled as a serious possibility. Every single party in the House of Commons, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, stood together behind one man. No procedural vote triggered it. No coalition agreement was negotiated. It happened organically, in real time, on live television, in a moment that is now being described by international observers as one of the most significant political transformations in Canadian history. Mark Carney did not just survive Trump's economic campaign. He was elevated by it. As of this afternoon, the Canadian press, allied foreign ministries, and the Prime Minister's own internal communications are using a term that has not been applied to a Canadian leader since 1944. Wartime leader. And the man responsible for creating that consensus, the man who handed Carney that political authority, was not a Canadian opposition figure. It was Donald Trump. This did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. Over the past several weeks, the White House deployed an escalating sequence of economic weapons against Canada. Tariff packages targeting energy, lumber, aluminum, and steel. Regulatory directives designed to strangle Canadian crude from American refineries. Personal sanctions on cabinet ministers. Asset freeze threats against sovereign pension funds. And a formal suspension of intelligence-sharing frameworks that Canada had co-built and co-funded for decades. Each escalation was designed to fracture Canadian resolve, calculated on the assumption that political opposition inside Canada would eventually break Carney. The White House did not just underestimate him. It fundamentally misread Canadian political psychology. Because here is what actually happened. But before we get into what this unity means strategically, if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, hit that subscribe button and like this video right now. The next 48 hours are going to matter enormously. Now here is the mechanism. Trump's pressure campaign did not divide Canada. It compressed it. Every escalation from Washington removed one more internal Canadian fault line. When personal sanctions landed on cabinet ministers, conservative leaders who had previously called for negotiation pivoted publicly. When the intelligence suspension was announced, the NDP, which had been critical of Carney's centrist economic positions, issued a joint statement with the Liberal government for the first time in 3 years. When asset seizure threats were floated targeting Canadian pension funds, the Bloc Québécois, whose entire political identity is built around provincial distinction from Ottawa, released a statement declaring that Quebec stands with Canada. That sentence, from the Bloc Québécois, that Quebec stands with Canada, would have been politically unthinkable 6 months ago. Trump manufactured it in 6 weeks. What Washington is confronting this morning is not a stronger Carney. It is a structurally different Canada. A Canada where the Prime Minister is no longer constrained by opposition pressure, by minority government arithmetic, or by the usual regional fractures that any Canadian leader must navigate. Carney now operates with something that no Canadian Prime Minister has had in a generation: genuine cross-party, cross-regional political authority. And this is where it gets strategically serious for Washington. Political unity of this kind translates directly into economic negotiating power. When Carney redirected crude oil export contracts toward Japan, South Korea, and Germany, he did so knowing no domestic political force would reverse those agreements after the next election. When he activated export controls on uranium, cobalt, and nickel, there was no opposition party ready to run against those controls and win. The permanence of these measures across election cycles is something the White House appears to have simply not calculated for. Here is why that permanence matters. Canada supplies roughly 60% of all American crude oil imports. The refineries across the Midwest and Gulf Coast that process that crude are engineered for heavy Canadian crude and cannot switch to lighter Saudi or Permian Basin oil without 18 to 24 months of retrofitting and billions in capital expenditure. What Carney's government is now doing, quietly but methodically, is signing long-term supply contracts with Asian and European buyers that lock Canadian production away from American markets for 10 to 15-year horizons. Once that export infrastructure is built, no future American administration can simply offer better terms and expect a reversal. The architecture will have already been constructed around a different set of partners. The American business community absorbed this faster than the White House did. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce described the situation as a structural realignment, not a negotiating posture. The American Petroleum Institute sent a private memo to senior Republican senators warning that the window for restoring the prior energy relationship was measured in weeks, not months. A senior executive at a major Midwest refinery group told the Financial Times, "What Canada has done is not a bargaining chip. It is a building permit for a different future. They are not threatening to leave. They are leaving in slow motion." The international dimension is where the White House's situation becomes genuinely precarious. Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom did not simply issue statements of solidarity. They accelerated active negotiations for the supply contracts that displace American access. Germany moved its Canadian LNG framework agreement from exploratory to operational phase. Japan doubled its crude volume commitment under its bilateral framework with Ottawa. South Korea moved its LNG facility timeline at Kitimat, British Columbia forward by 6 months. These are not symbolic gestures. These are capital deployment decisions by American allies, concluding that Canadian supply is more reliable than American partnership. America's own allies are making infrastructure bets against American energy dominance. Inside the White House, the strategic problem is now being described by people with senior staff access as a compound failure. The original theory was that economic pain would generate Canadian political fragmentation, which would generate domestic pressure on Carney, which would eventually produce a phone call requesting terms. Every step of that chain has failed. The pain was real. The fragmentation never materialized. The domestic pressure reversed direction. And Carney has not called. A former senior National Security Council official, speaking to Politico without attribution, said the administration confused Canada's politeness for softness. Those are not the same quality. We discovered that difference at considerable cost. Trump now has 3 options, and none of them recover the starting position. He can maintain the current pressure campaign and watch Canadian long-term energy contracts with Asian and European buyers become permanent, locking American refineries into a structural shortage no executive order can reverse. He can attempt a quiet de-escalation, but that path requires Carney's cooperation, and Carney has stated publicly that no negotiation begins while punitive measures remain. Trump would need to move first, unilaterally and visibly, handing Carney the narrative framing of that retreat. Or he can escalate further, but every tool remaining would require targeting countries beyond Canada, because Canada has already integrated those countries into its response architecture. Any further American pressure now lands simultaneously on Japan, Germany, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. That is not a trade dispute with a neighbor. That is a structural conflict with the core of the Western alliance. The detail most analysts are missing is the one that carries the most strategic weight. Mark Carney did not create this unity by giving a great speech. He created it by preparing for 18 months before anyone understood what was being prepared. The energy infrastructure, the export contract frameworks, the intelligence sharing contingencies with Britain, the mineral export control mechanisms, none of it was improvised. It was designed before Trump's pressure arrived. What Parliament unified behind was not a reaction. It was the revelation of a plan. And the difference between a country reacting to a crisis and a country executing a plan it already built is the difference between vulnerability and leverage. 2 hours ago, an entire national parliament stood as one. Not because a charismatic leader demanded it. Because a methodical, analytically precise leader spent the better part of 2 years making certain that when the moment arrived, the country would have something worth standing for. Trump wanted to isolate Canada internationally. He unified it internally. He wanted to fracture its political class. He fused it. He wanted to demonstrate that economic pressure produces compliance. He produced the opposite, a country that is now more durable, more strategically aligned with alternative partners, and more insulated from American leverage than at any point in the modern era. Washington is now confronting a Canada it did not build and cannot unbuild. The wartime leader did not emerge despite Trump's campaign. He emerged because of it.